Welcome to Is It the Podcast? From Rembrandt to Rubens, from Van Dyck to Van Eyck, each episode examines an artwork with an uncertain authorship, in dialogue with a leading guest expert. We'll tell the story of the artist we suspect created the work, of the work in question, and then we reveal the results of a cutting-edge AI authentication analysis performed by the Swiss firm Art Recognition. I'm your host, Professor Noah Charney. So, is it? Caravaggio lived a violent fist of a life, but man could he paint. He's one of a handful of true revolutionaries, creating a style that was unlike anything that had come before and was hugely influential. But he made only some 60 paintings depending on which scholar you ask, so each is incredibly valuable. And not one has come up for auction in the last century or so. Today's episode reveals some big surprises regarding 3 known versions of a painting called The Lute Player. But are all 3 by Caravaggio? Let's find out. He was a brawler, a genius, a fugitive, and a pioneer. The man who changed the course of Western painting didn't live to see 50, and yet Caravaggio's impact still reverberates through galleries and studios around the world. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio was born in 1570, and from the start he was different. At a time when art was polished, idealized, and often drenched in religious symbolism, Caravaggio took a radical turn. He painted what he saw: real people, real skin, real dirt beneath fingernails, and he painted it with shocking intensity and realism. Caravaggio's style was revolutionary. Figures burst from darkness, bathed in dramatic light that seems to fall from an invisible spotlight. This technique, chiaroscuro, or the use of stark light and shadow, wasn't new, but no one had wielded it with such theatrical force before. In his hands, it became something else entirely, not just a style but a mood, a kind of visual poetry. But this technique was as bold as his brushwork. Rather than sketching in advance with chalk or charcoal, Caravaggio often dove straight into the canvas. He would incise lines directly into the surface using the blunt end of his brush, cutting through the primed canvas to mark out figures with ghostly scratches. It gave his work an immediacy, a rawness that was unheard of in his day. He painted peasants as saints, prostitutes as Madonnas, his own lovers and enemies as biblical figures. He merged the sacred and profane in a way that scandalized and mesmerized in equal measure. His St. Matthew didn't have dainty hands and flowing robes. He was a weathered old man with dirt on his feet. His Judith wasn't merely poised, she was fierce and unnervingly real. And off the canvas, Caravaggio's life read like a criminal rap sheet. Brawls, arrests, a murder charge, and a decade on the run across Italy, seeking commissions and evading justice. Yet in every city or island he fled to, Naples, Malta, Sicily, he left behind masterpieces. Today, Caravaggio is remembered as the father of Baroque painting, but also as one of art history's great bad boys. He showed that beauty could be found in imperfection, that saints could look like streetwalkers, and that darkness could reveal more than light. Today I have 2 special guests. Carina Popovici is the co-founder and CEO of Art Recognition, a Swiss company that uses artificial intelligence to authenticate artworks, and they're the sponsor of this podcast series. To learn more about her work, check out a full episode-length interview in which we discuss art recognition, AI, and her fascinating career. Along with Carina, I'm joined by Clovis Whiftield. Clovis is a British art historian, gallerist, and one of the world's foremost experts on Italian Old Master paintings. Trained at Cambridge and the Corto Institute, both my alma maters as well, he's built a career at the intersection of scholarship and the art market. Back in 1979, he founded Whitfield Fine Art in London, a gallery known for rediscovering important but overlooked works by Baroque and Renaissance masters. Over the decades, Clovis has earned a reputation for his keen eye, often identifying misattributed paintings and returning them to their rightful place in art history. He's also an accomplished author and curator. His books and exhibitions, particularly on Caravaggio and his circle, have influenced how we understand the technical brilliance and radical vision of these artists. His publication Caravaggio's Eye explores the painter's innovative use of light, space, and optics. Whether working with collectors, museums, or scholars, Clovis Whiftield brings a deep knowledge and lifelong passion for uncovering the truth behind the canvas. And his traditional research has uncovered the truth about the 3 Lute Player paintings, which was confirmed by AI image analysis. Clovis, let's begin by having you describe the painting that you chose to have analyzed, the Lute Player. There are multiple versions of it, but first please describe what we would see when we look at the ex-badminton picture.
Yes, the picture is of this lute player who is a rather beautiful boy, and I emphasize that because the patron liked beautiful boys. It is an exercise which obviously taxed him greatly to get every bit of it accurately depicted, and that includes the musical instruments, but also his eyebrows and every aspect of his appearance. And so you have this rather charming subject, a lute player playing wonderful music, obviously, and it happened to be rather famous as a picture because it is in the literature, but for various reasons it had been forgotten because there is a picture in the Hermitage which has rather occupied its place. And that came also from a famous collection, that of the Giustiniani. And so the fame was really erased for this picture until it turned up at the turn of the century, and it attracted my attention.
Now, you mentioned that there is a version at the Hermitage. Can you tell us, in terms of a superficial appearance, if we look at the Hermitage picture next to the ex-badminton, what is the main difference? I've looked at them side by side, and it's a bit like that game Spot the Difference that children play, because they're very similar, but there are some differences.
Yes, the main difference is the absence of the still life with the glass carafe, and it is generally more, badminton picture is much more detailed, and he obviously didn't finish the glass carafe, which turns out was rather important for his patron. His patron was very interested in glassmaking, and he was trying to get his glassmakers to make a perfect crystal glass, which didn't have the bubbles in it that you get normally in Venetian glass. And so it was technically something that would please him. He was also interested in nature and the flowers and all that, and he painted meticulously everything that he saw, not only the strings of the lute and the violin, but also the dewdrops on the flowers. And you're aware that this is minutely observed, so much so that it looks for him like it would if it were a transparency done in front of the subject. And that is what he was trying to do. He was trying to make something which looked indeed like a camera obscura picture, and there were camera obscura enthusiasts around, and they saw these images, and when they saw Caravaggio's painting, they realized this is what the world looks like.
So that brings us perfectly to my next question. I wanted you to talk us through the provenance of the ex-badminton picture. And you mentioned Cardinal del Monte, one of Caravaggio's earliest patrons, who, as you say, was an alchemist. He was interested in crystal and glass, and he had a personal collection of musical instruments. Can you walk us through the provenance from Caravaggio's time to the present? And don't forget to tell us about the Duke of Beaufort in Italy.
He was in a bad way. He had lost his studio, and he generally didn't even have the materials to paint with. And Del Monte, who knew of him, had in fact pictures by him, heard that he was in a bad way, and sent his emissary to find him. And he found the painter sleeping on the plinth of a statue, Pasquina, which is by Piazza Navona. And although he was in rags, and actually the biographer says that he had no clothes on, but he was summoned to Palazzo Madama, which was where Del Monte lived as representative of the Medici here in Rome. And he set him up and gave him rooms. And it's then that he did a few paintings. And we think that, as Baglioni mentions these paintings, first of all, the musicians and the lute player, that it was Del Monte who enabled Caravaggio to get the commission for the paintings in San Luigi dei Francesi, which made his career, changed it so that you have this separation from the earlier paintings, which are largely of profane subjects, to religious paintings, because these were much more lucrative. He could go on to doing big pictures with multiple figures, all of them studied from life. The lute player and the musicians were important ambassadors, as it were, testimonials of what he could do, and would impress people no end.
So from Caravaggio's time at Palazzo Madama, or let's say from the end of his life, can we trace the path of the painting to Badminton House?
Yes, the painting was obviously one of about half a dozen paintings that Del Monte had. After Caravaggio became important, even Del Monte couldn't afford his pictures anymore, but he had these key paintings from the beginning, and he was very proud of them and didn't allow them to be copied. He thought that devalued them. And indeed, that is something which is intrinsic to the history of this subject. But when he died, Del Monte was insistent that his collections should stay together and nothing should be sold. But the Barberini, who then ruled the roost, Urban VIII, had been made Pope in 1623, and he decided that his collection should be dispersed. And so there was a sale, and the more important pictures were in fact bought by Antonio Barberini, who was Urban VIII's young nephew. He was also only 19 at the time. And so he was sponsored by the papal treasurer to buy these important pictures. And there was a group of 5 paintings that was bought in 1628, which included the lute player and the musicians for record prices. And Antonio kept them in the new Palazzo Barberini, which we all know in Rome, and he kept them with his musical instruments. He bought organs and had a wonderful display, and he was very proud of them. So much so that when Urban VIII died, which was in 1644, the Barberini, who'd been so they'd spent so much of the papal treasury that they were most unpopular, and they fled to Paris, in fact. But when eventually, 5 years later, Antonio came back, he rescued the Caravaggios, and he had them in the old palazzo, which was some way away by the Tiber, and the 3 important Caravaggios, the lute player, the St. Catherine, and the card sharps, were opposite his bed in 1671. And that's the time when, in fact, it's the last moment that we have a description of the lute player in the Barberini collection, because it seems as though at that point the heir, who was I wouldn't say he was a ne'er-do-well nephew, but anyway, he inherited the responsibility of the collection, and the Caravaggios were supposed to be transferred to the new Palazzo Barberini, but the lute player wasn't among them. And after that, we find that it was substituted with a picture which was of slightly different description, a woman playing the lute. And it was a slight, you need to be a detective to do this, but it was of a slightly different size. And we know that because you can trace it, that this replacement from 1672, in fact, until 1948, when the Wildenstein painting was sold. But from above, it was the last connection with Caravaggio that was in the Barberini collection. But we haven't mentioned this other version, which, as I say, has a woman playing the lute. And this obviously was done as a substitute, or was bought as a substitute, because the family were enjoined not to sell anything. And this was, in fact, a fideikommesso, which was basically an entail that Urban VIII had set on the entire collection, because he thought that these were really important cultural steps in Italian art. And so they were not supposed to sell anything, but of course they found their way around it by introducing this imitation, which, is probably painted a couple of decades later than the original. It was so exciting to see the picture when I first saw it, covered with varnish of unbelievable depth.
Let me ask Clovis, tell me about when you first saw it, but also don't forget to tell us, how did it get to England? Because that's a really interesting twist on the story.
The picture was, in fact, bought on the Grand Tour by the third Duke in Rome. And it was, in fact, one of the Knights of Malta, Prior Vaini, who brought him this picture and sold it to him, actually, in order to lessen the subject. It was altered. It was Caravaggio's Venetian courtesan, because if it had been a good religious subject, then they wouldn't have got. Even then, we had not an export reviewing committee, but we'd have people who thought that some things were so important that they shouldn't leave. And so he sold him this painting for 200 crowns. And so in 1727, it was taken with, I think there were 93 cases of art and sculpture and all that, which were shipped from Livorno, Leghorn, to Gloucestershire. And this was obviously one of the jewels. It was off the radar until the 10th Duke sold it to Sotheby's in 1969. And then it disappeared again. It was sold by Leonard Kurtzer, I think, to a collector in Athens who was a member of the Averroff family. And then it turned up again in 2001, which is when I saw it first. And it was then when I got it back and did the X-rays of the painting, that I saw the countenance, and the rest was quite straightforward. But it is really interesting, because it does also demonstrate that from time to time Caravaggio did do two versions. In fact, in his early career, he did several versions, because once he had done a picture, it was easier to do a copy of it for himself, rather than to go through all the labor of observing each little detail. And it's quite an interesting process that one can gather of how he did this. But he was like every other painter. Once he had done something, he wasn't shy of doing it again.
This is a very good segue, now that you've talked to us through the provenance. So the provenance of the ex-Badminton picture makes perfect sense that it's authentic. Appearance, of course, just take a look at it, and it is a bit subjective depending on an expert's point of view, but to most, it looks absolutely authentic. You did some forensic testing, like X-rays, and everything there adds up. And now we bring in this new component. And I'd like to ask Carina Popovici, who's one of the founders of Art Recognition, to join us now. Okay, Carina, the moment of truth. So what was the result of the AI analysis of the ex-badminton Lute Player?
Yeah, so we have trained our AI on Caravaggio, and we have passed the Lute Player through the system, and the result was 85.7% authentic.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a very big score, actually. And I think it does support in every way all the other investigations that have been done on this painting. So the X-rays and everything else that Clovis has mentioned.
Tell me a little bit about what that means. 85.7%, I know it sounds very high because I've also heard about cases where you've examined something and it was, say, 68%, and that was also quite compelling. But 85.7 sounds definitive. But what does that percentage actually mean in practice?
So that percentage means that that's what we call the probability of authenticity. So the way it works is that the AI is being presented with what we call training images. So it sees authentic art pieces by Caravaggio, also not authentic. It learns all of the characteristic features of Caravaggio, but also what makes or what distinguishes a Caravaggio from a very good copy of Caravaggio. So with all of this information, it compares what it sees on the new painting, so on the Lute Player in this case, with what it's learned from the training. And this authenticity probability is being returned as a result of that comparison. So it basically tells with what probability the painting that the AI is analyzing right now is by the hand of the trained artist.
That's quite clear, but the key point for any artist is how you train the AI. And your team is particularly good at this and particularly detailed. So let's just go through it with Caravaggio. You usually begin with a catalog raisonné for training images. Tell me about why you use a catalog raisonné. And also, sometimes there are rival catalogs raisonné with slightly different content.
Exactly.
And how do you choose which is the one to go with?
Yes. So ideally, the catalog should be the golden standard and the consensus of art historians and experts for what's worth. Now, there are all sorts of difficult situations, as we know. Caravaggio is no exception, unfortunately, but that's the reason, that we use catalog resonance, because they are, in theory at least, encapsulating all the knowledge about an artist's oeuvre. So in this case, we decided to choose the Catalogue Raisonné by Rosella Vondré, which appeared in 2021. This was actually a practical consideration, because it was the most recent, the most updated, but also because we felt that it was more inclusive, Like it wasn't just her own assessment, but it did contain interesting remarks about the opinions of other experts, we felt it was quite particular, considering, that usually an expert would stick to their opinion and discard anything else. So this was really a very good basis for us to select the training data and to run the training.
So let's get to the tricky part. What do you do when there are attributions that experts disagree on? And sometimes you get experts of equally high status and qualification who think the opposite things of each other. One example is with the Wildenstein Lute Player. Very famous art historians think it's by Caravaggio, and very famous ones think it's not. And how do you deal with that when you're teaching the AI?
This is an excellent question. The situation with Caravaggio, I think it's even more difficult than other difficult situations, because as far as I know, in general, the catalogs, they are used as a reference, not just by the scholars, but also by the market. And it seems that the various experts, they haven't been able to agree, on the catalog that should be used as a reference. And because of that, no auction house dared to sell Caravaggio. So literally, no Caravaggio has ever been sold at auction. So that's the situation. Now, the experts, they don't seem to be arguing only about the catalogs, but also about what should be in a certain catalog and what should be out of a certain catalog. So it can't get more complicated than that. What we did essentially was to come up with like a scoring system. So like our own expert scoring system for the disputed work. So literally we had created a matrix, with the experts on one axis and the disputed works on the other axis. And we tried, to clear the situation. And then for Caravaggio, for example, there are 4 such paintings. We discussed them extensively also with Clovis. There is the Taking of Christ, I believe, the Sleeping Peter, and a couple of more. So what we did in this case, our art historians in the team, they went through the existing literature to see what the scholars had to say about those paintings. And then we started filling out the matrix. So we've checked, the articles written by Mina Grigori, Longhi, Zuccari, so all of these experts. So it wasn't just a quick poll, it's not like we called them and asked like, what do you think? It was like a genuine piece of research that we did in the team. And, after pulling all of this information from books and articles, we reached the conclusion that the majority had the view that these 4 paintings, that they aren't by Caravaggio, and therefore we removed them from the data set. So that's what we did. It's an extensive, research for every single artist, actually, but that's the only way that can work.
Clovis, did you want to add something?
I want to say that in the past, we have relied on connoisseurs who have determined, in their wisdom and their great experience, people like Friedlander or Longhi, Briganti, who you would go to and tap on their door and say, is this right? And they would consider it and they would give you that opinion. In fact, was not ever a very satisfactory way of dealing with it. And it is very useful to have an empirical procedure to sift some of these works and to understand which are original and which are copies. And one has to understand with Caravaggio that he was so innovative that even a copy of his painting could look wildly more realistic than most of the competition, because it was, in fact, although just removed from the original, it was nonetheless much more realistic than most of other people's paintings. So this has confused the catalogue of Caravaggio's work, because there are pictures in the catalogue which seem to be original, or indeed in a lot of the catalogues, and in fact they have copies. And this doesn't even take into account the second versions which Caravaggio did. But in the 1900 years ago, when they began to be interested in Caravaggio again, the idea grew that Caravaggio only did a single version of any picture. Well, that didn't take into account the fact that he was hungry. It is very interesting to study the first version, the second version, then the copies. And this is something where AI can obviously help, because it's not just looking at the materials, but it's actually the composition itself is subtly different. Obviously, when it's a copy, you can see that it's a copy. When it's a second version, that's a tougher Gordian knot to cut.
It's also, it's unbiased by ego and hypothesis bias, which brings me to the other question for you, Carina. So, okay, the ex-Badminton version tested as certainly authentic. What about the Hermitage and the Wildensteins that some people think are authentic and some people don't? And which part of your data set, I know when you build the data set that you have the positive examples, but you also have negative examples with which you teach the AI what not to be fooled by. So where do you put the Hermitage and the Wildenstein, in which category, and how did that work? And did you test either of them as well?
So because the Hermitage version is recorded, so it is really listed also in the Vaudreuil catalogue as an authentic piece by Caravaggio, and indeed it has a very clear, very straightforward provenance, then we had put it into the training set as an authentic example and trained on it so that the AI also has learned, from the other examples, but also from this one. And then in addition to the ex-Badminton version, we have analyzed also the Wildenstein version separately. And the result on it was 38% authentic. So that makes a 62% probability of the Wildenstein version to be not authentic. That's quite interesting, actually. I mean, this is a bit of a speculation, but it really shows that it's a very good copy. The AI didn't return a 80%, 90% result, but a slightly lower one, which indeed, I mean, in my opinion, might be an indication that this is very well produced copy over the real one. So that's what we did in terms of the analysis. Now, for the negative examples, so we have included in the data set many of the so-called Caravaggisti, so artists that came right after him, and they were inspired from him, like Artemisia Gentileschi, for example, or her father, Orazio Gentileschi. We also used Mattia Preti, Bartolomeo Manfredi, but also other artists, Northern artists like Rubens, for example, as Clovis was saying. He was very impressed with Caravaggio, so we used him in the data set. Also, Gerard van Honthorst, so other artists that were not just confined, to the Italian space, but they were also active in the Northern Europe. So the compilation of the negative examples is again another art historical projects in its own right, going to the books, to the articles, finding all of these artists that are perhaps less well known, but their artworks are important. So in order to feed them into the AI. And actually what we do, I mean, a little twist, which is fun, to talk about. We are creating, I mean, this brings us fast forward to today, like kind of a funny tech addition. So we have in our company actually different AI that is a generative AI, and we create a replica of the training set. So for every single positive example, we create an AI version of it that's being fed into the training as a negative example. And this is actually very helpful. We researched this. I mean, we also published actually our research about it, and we have understood that AI generated works, so negative examples which are AI generated, they help to identify better the human-made copies.
Carina, what's your opinion regarding the situation of the Lute Player now? And by extension, how do you think AI will play a role in such outcomes in the future?
The current situation of the Lute Player is extremely complex, again, because of the controversies among experts. For building a data set is relatively straightforward to handle them. You just compile the expert opinions, you weigh them and decide what to include, what not to include. But when it comes to selling a painting, it's a completely different story. And indeed, we see that this deadlock spills into the market, and works like the Lute Player can't be sold, which shows how stuck the situation has become. So the experts, they hold so much influence that nobody dares to move forward. Having said that, I genuinely believe that AI can help unlock this situation. By bringing transparency, objectivity, we can shift the discussion away from these very entrenched positions toward evidence-based analysis and hopefully put an end to the endless arguments. So in that sense, I see AI as opening a new chapter for the art market, where works like the Lute Player, for example, could finally be considered with more clarity and less conflict.
The mystery appears to be solved. The Hermitage and ex-Badminton Lute Player paintings are by Caravaggio himself, but the Wildenstein version appears not to be so. Is It the podcast will have more breaking news, twists, and surprises to come, so be sure to subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening to Is It the podcast? This series is produced by Urshka Charney, presented by Noah Charney, and is brought to you by Art Recognition. Based in Zurich, Art Recognition is the leading firm for AI-driven authentication of artworks. Featured everywhere from the Art newspaper to Wired to The Guardian and beyond, Art Recognition uses the most definitive, sophisticated datasets and advanced processes to estimate the likelihood that a specific artist created an artwork. Backed by a multidisciplinary team that takes many dimensions of research into consideration, art recognition has a long track record of success at the highest level. Learn more at art-recognition.com. That's art-recognition.com. We'll be back next time with a new art historical mystery, a new possible artist behind the masterpiece, and a new guest expert. See you next time.